So, as
Oh,
my,
oh, I'm sorry.
oh,
I'll
I'm
start with
sorry.
a quick little introduction.
Okay, cut.
Hello, everyone. Mike Lagerquist here from Vine. Thank you for joining us today. A topic that I think is going to be very interesting to hear about. At our Kiwanis meeting on Monday, we had a similar presentation, and I know that it might bring up some ideas that you hadn't even thought about before, as far as what we're going through right now in this odd time. But we have with us Dr. Katie Wojtalewicz.
Pretty
Close,
close, yes.
pretty
Yep.
close, from the Mankato Clinic, who is going to speak a little bit about coping in anxious and stressful times, which I think is something that we can all relate to right now as we wake up each day not really knowing what's going to be happening. So we have had to work with our coping skills and mellowing our anxiety as much as we can just to make it through the day sometimes. So, and with this, I will step aside. Please know that that Katie is willing to take questions at any time. So if you would like to ask something, just do something to kind of wait for a pause in the action, perhaps, and then you can ask a question when there's a pause. And I'm going to go through here and mute everybody except, I hope, Katie. So we will go ahead. Thank you very much. Here is Katie. Katie, Dr. Katie.
Thank you. Yeah, so it's Katie Wojtalewicz, like itch, if that helps. But I always kind of remind people I'm comfortable being called Katie. You don't have to even do the doctor part. Just to give you a little bit of background on who I am, since a lot of you might not know me. I have been employed as a psychologist here at Mankato Clinic just since February, but I've been working around the area actually for the last a little over a decade at this point. I grew up in St. James and I went to college at St. Ben's. And then I got my doctorate in psychology from the University of Denver. So I returned kind of to this area and worked in St. James and New Ulm and Mankato before coming to Mankato Clinic here. I tend to see all ages. So I see young kids and I see nursing home residents and pretty much everybody in between there. So lots of settings as well. I've worked with schools, drug courts, military, ERs, you name it. So got a lot of things that we've seen stress and anxiety basically come up. So today I just kind of wanted to give you a sense of objective wise. I know it always kind of helps going into a presentation to kind of have a sense of what we might expect, even if we go on some tangents and cover other things. Generally, I want to kind of just give you some background, of course, on the roots of anxiety and stress and maybe some of the differences between how we define those, just to kind of give us a jumping off point. As you know, we happen to be in a very stressful time, so it's kind of hard to talk about anxiety and stress without kind of talking about the pandemic a little bit more specifically and all the sort of challenges that have come with that. So we'll definitely take some time to kind of discuss the things that maybe are a little unique to the times we're in. And then, of course, the part most people are here for, I'm sure, is talking about how to deal with it in the first place. So some strategies for managing that stress and anxiety. I want to make sure we definitely get to that part and have some time. So if you see me looking to my left occasionally, I'm just kind of using that as a place to have my notes, but I'll try and keep my eyes peeled like we were talking about. So if somebody has questions, feel free to run them my way. I tend to be pretty conversational because as therapists, we're used to kind of the back and forth part. So that works good for me. So a place I want to kind of start is obviously just talking about what anxiety is and how maybe we think of it as different from stress. So typically when we think of stress, we talk about it almost as a measurement, right? Like, so a bridge, for example. Stress is essentially a measurement of how much weight or pressure something can endure, right? So as people, our version of that is the strain and tension on us, basically under trying circumstances or under conditions.
Yeah, here. Yeah, but I want to hear him. Oh.
So stress, I'm curious if anybody wants to weigh in on this. We often obviously describe it as something that's negative and we don't want it. Anybody have a sense of times where it might actually be constructive and a positive thing to have in our lives?
well, I don't know if it would necessarily be stress per se, but I would think if you're, say like a professional athlete or somebody who needs to perform in a certain situation, having that little bit of stress, those butterflies, if you're an actor, for example, might
Hmm.
be something that helps you maybe focus or concentrate on what you've got in front of you.
Exactly. So the acting one's actually a good example because one of the things I often did in my free time was direct theater, and I've acted a lot in my life. And that's a perfect example of sometimes performance anxiety or stress that we experience. Obviously, if we have too much of it, it can kind of get in the way. But having just enough keeps us kind of on our toes. So it's the difference between that person who walks out on stage and feels so relaxed and so confident, they don't need anything. And guess what happens? They forget their lines and they kind of have a deer in headlights effect. Probably same with an athlete. If they're so overly confident that their head's not in it, they're not going to probably perform the way they were hoping. So on some level, that's kind of an asset to us. It's more when it kind of becomes too much that it gets us in trouble. So one way to think about this, and kind of maybe the differences between good stress and bad stress, so to speak, is something I'd call active versus passive stress. So active stress is the kind of stress that has a solution and we can take some action to resolve it. So one example might be stress about having a test if you're a student coming up. Okay, one way that you can resolve it is to study more and reduce your stress about being prepared for it. So it may be stressful, but there's something concrete that you can do that should probably help make that manageable. Passive stress, which tends to be a little harder on us, is the kind where we're sort of helpless to do much about it. And it's kind of just a weight that we're carrying on us. So one common example might actually be if you're trying to get somewhere really important and you're just stuck in traffic, which is a really kind of just frustrating feeling, and it tends to really build up that stress because short of running across on the hoods of cars, we're probably not going to get where we need to go, right? So what do you think of those two kinds is in the end worse for you? Passive or active? What takes more of a toll on us?
I would say the passive, unless the positive happens too often, maybe.
True, or we don't kind of resolve it in the ways we maybe could. Like if we have
Right.
those tests and we just kind of don't study for them and resolve them, that definitely would add up. But yeah, the costs of that passive stress are often what we think of as not just the emotional stress, but think of the just sort of health risks, right? We know a lot of disease is tied to if we manage our stress well or not, because as we know, stress on some level is inevitable. I don't know many people that manage to get off scot-free and not have some stress they have to deal with. And so part of that is kind of where this comes in today, where we want to talk a little bit about ways we manage it. So anxiety, in trying to kind of understand where that fits in here, is if we think of anxiety in this context, it might be best thought of as how we think and feel about the stress in this case, right? Stress doesn't always affect two people in the same way. So sometimes, despite enormous stress or adversity, people are surprisingly resilient. In fact, we're attracted to those stories of just the things people come through despite the odds against them. Sometimes it leaves what I kind of call it like a residue, where maybe it's just sort of underlying the surface and it gets to us sometimes, but we kind of tune it out for the most part. Of course, the extreme on the other end would be that it can have a very paralyzing effect on us, and that's where more severe anxiety comes in. And certainly where I come in as a therapist is when it gets more debilitating and gets in the way. And of course, sometimes anxiety can occur without stress, which is really frustrating to people, but of course can be, a combination of biological factors like brain chemistry sometimes can just change on us in that way. Genetics certainly play a role in that. So sometimes there may not be an obvious kind of cause of it, but we'll focus today a little bit more on the stress and the anxiety that kind of comes from the cause. So how would we usually characterize anxiety? Like when I use that word, what do you kind of think of as far as symptoms you might have, or what rises in you when you're anxious?
Well, for me, I kind of relate it to uncertainty. So I like to know what's going to happen next or what I'm going to do. So if I don't have that ability, that's when I start getting kind of freaked out.
Yes, freaked out is a good word for that, right? We have varying degrees of freaking out. Yep, so a lot of it is, you know, tension, right? Some people, it's almost literally in our muscles. We might feel more tense. We even get things like headaches from just feeling that stress, right? A nervousness generally, like maybe feeling kind of on edge or jumpy, you might even say. And of course, you know, even just kind of fear at its most extreme, where we have like the fight or flight reaction or panic attacks is also anxiety. So we can experience it kind of as a physiological thing, particularly in the case of that panic feeling, where our heart might race, might be hard to breathe. We might feel like, you know, we're hot and cold, we're dizzy, sweaty. Like a lot of people have experienced a panic attack or something like it, even without having maybe a chronic pattern in their life of it. Sometimes we just find ourselves in those situations and that caveman brain of fight or flight kicks in as though we're facing a big threat and need to be ready for battle. So I think, Mike, like you hit on something that is a very common thread and really important through all anxiety of all kinds, and that is uncertainty, right? So when we think about what anxiety basically is, it's a distress about that unknown, right? And feeling uncomfortable with uncertainty. And so a lot of the things we do, for better and worse, are attempts to kind of get back in control of things the best we can. Sometimes it's successful, sometimes it just doesn't get us where we want to go. So when we use the word uncertainty, I'm curious, what does that remind you of these days? Anybody know of a pandemic that might be creating some of that noise in us right now?
And the constant word we hear of unprecedented.
Oh, right. Yes. We need all those unwords to really drive home that things feel kind of unhinged, don't we? Right. And that's kind of where I think the pandemic has posed some very unique challenges to a lot of us that we really aren't accustomed to up to this point. And I think there's a couple reasons for that. One is we're not only facing new stressors, right? Of, okay, now we're worried about this virus, of contracting it or spreading it to others. That itself is plenty to worry about and has a lot of us anxious. Of course, we also have all the economic costs of things that have been going on from the pandemic, and that creates all kinds of stress and upheaval and uncertainty in our lives. Excuse me. My phone never rings until the moment I'm doing a presentation. So I think one of the things that makes the pandemic that much harder is not only do we have all these new stressors, the things we usually do to cope with the stressors are also pulled out from under us, right? So one of the kind of go-to things, of course, we do when we feel stressed is that we try to connect and reach out to people in our lives. Well, suddenly that's harder. Suddenly that at least has some extra obstacles, and when we do get to do it, of course, isn't quite the same as like today if we were doing our presentation. Doing it in person, there's definitely certain things that get lost when you don't get to kind of connect in that way. And as a therapist, believe me, I get that part. You know, there's a lot of subtlety in being able to be with people that's different, right? So the other part is, I think, we can be surprisingly adaptable when we're given a finish line, right? So like when we first found out, you know, this is pretty rough and we're gonna have to pull back and we're gonna have to sacrifice, I think it felt temporary. We didn't know exactly when the finish line was, but our impression was like, well, this is sure strange to get used to, but we're all in this together. And then time went on, and it felt like, oh, I guess that didn't work as much as maybe we thought it would, or here's a new curveball. And so not only are we trying to adapt to changes of the changes, we have a hard time kind of knowing, well, when will we get the reward of all this hard work, that it'll pay off and all these uncertain things will start to kind of resolve. And I think that's where some of that fatigue sets in. It's where we feel more burnt out and we feel the weight of the stress and the anxiety. Any kind of questions or thoughts up to this point about some of those things?
If you do, don't forget to unmute yourself first. Oh,
Okay.
we've got a silent bunch today. They're all
right,
just
well,
taking it in.
Okay, I just know sometimes when I get going, I talk fast. So if you need to interrupt me, you know.
Margaret, did you have something, Margaret?
Well, it's strange living here at Old Main because I haven't been out of this building since March. And so it's kind of I'm getting stir crazy, I guess, but it really hasn't bothered me very much. But now I'm planning on maybe going for a ride and going to some familiar places. And if I quarantine for 2 weeks afterwards, it'll be worth it. So that's kind of what I'm planning to do if I need to cope with it.
Mm-hmm. And as you know, that's something we've been, as it's dragged on, that's something we've been discussing is, okay, well, we know that like as much as all these kind of restrictions and things were necessary and still are necessary, is maybe we need to find and strike a balance for our mental health, for kind of having some version of moving forward and keeping some normalcy, is we need to sort of essentially weigh kind of the risks and the benefits of making certain choices like that, right? So they talk about, absolutely, we get it. There's a certain point where you want to connect with people in your lives you've been cut off from. So, hey, what are some ways we can do that feel at least on the safer side and not maybe putting you at more risk than you need to? So I know that's been a big discussion, is how can we kind of adapt, and it may not be quite the same, but it's at least a compromise. So good example. Mm-hmm. So this is something where I think, you know, we do have scientific evidence of the toll chronic stress can take. So that kind of prolonged stress, they've studied this pretty extensively, and this will probably not surprise anyone, but of course it can have a kind of paralyzing effect on us. And this is where both anxiety and depression can come in, where it feels like if it doesn't let up, it just sort of continues to tax our ability to cope and be resourceful, and it can kind of make us feel helpless to change our circumstances. So this may sound really defeating, but there's something really important that comes in here. So who can tell me the Serenity Prayer? I mean, I can tell you, but if anybody happens to be able to recite it or wing it, that would be great.
It's something like accept the things that I can't change, and that's kind of
Yeah,
just.
Yep, you're on the right track there. Do you want me to just do it? And then we can all nod and say, oh yes, that sounds familiar. So it's basically, God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So which part do you think we're pretty good at, and which part are we maybe a little rusty at a lot of the time? I can tell you, in my experience as a therapist, going through this process a lot with people, is even though sometimes, yeah, we're a little slow to take action, we at least kind of know those situations where we can control something. We're fairly good at problem solving, right? We do it in jobs all the time. It's kind of an instinct as human beings that we have. And so I think that that's something that often we get that part, at least. We understand it. It's kind of how we're built. The part we maybe struggle with a little bit more is the accepting that stuff we can't change. And of course, like we were just talking about, when you have a lot of stuff in that column, that can be very paralyzing. So that's part of what I'm here today to kind of talk to you about, is not just stuff we can control but also, hey, what about that stuff that really is out of our hands, and how can we learn to kind of move forward in spite of that? Because that's definitely what's ahead of us in a pandemic, isn't it? Okay, so let's start with the things we can change column, because this is stuff that will probably be familiar, but it never hurts to kind of cover some of the ideas in case there's some that resonate more than others with you. So I like to kind of think of this as having two sort of approaches, right? There's coping strategies for when we're already feeling the stress and the anxiety and what we do to manage it. But there's also, of course, some prevention strategies that we can think about to wall off at least some of that stress, or make it at least a little more manageable before we get to that point where we're really struggling. So there's the physiological kinds of coping strategies. So number one on the list, you'll hear most therapists talk about, deep breathing, right? Who's heard of that one? Yep. And the reason we say it isn't just because, you know, it's simple and then we can kind of shoo you away. It actually is something that's extremely well researched. Cecily, are you having a malfunction over there?
I think she had two computers going at the same time. I was probably getting feedback between them. So
My apologies.
You're
I'm
fine.
so disruptive.
Yes, sit down and behave.
Okay.
Uh-huh. So there's obviously, like on the deep breathing, the thing that helps is essentially when you bring it down deep into your lungs, you know, that's helping essentially like manage that adrenaline that's surging through your body that you feel when you're extremely anxious. And so putting, you know, there's a lot of strategies, but the simplest one that I learned is essentially, you know, if you put your hand on your stomach, when you take a deep breath in, you should be pushing it kind of all the way down into your diaphragm, and you'll feel your hand on your stomach push out like a balloon. That's how you know you're truly taking a good deep breath. And one thing you can do to kind of just walk through a pattern to sort of help yourself is as simple as just in one through your nose, and then out one through your mouth. In two through your nose, out two through your mouth. Some of you may also be familiar with, I think they call it like box breathing, square breathing. It's something, especially the military likes that one because it's kind of 1, 2, 3, 4, and it suits them. And so that one is basically breathing in a pattern of in 2, 3, 4, hold 2, 3, 4, out 2, 3, 4, rest 2, 3, 4. And the idea is you just kind of some version or another where you can track that you're trying to kind of be deliberate in getting that down into your lungs and exhaling it through your body. And the reason that helps is because one of the best ways you can get that heart rate managed is, of course, you can't just tell your heart slow down and stop beating so fast, right? So this is essentially a version of that by regulating your breathing and slowing it down and making it more steady, that helps kind of bring that adrenaline level down, and that itself will kind of get your heart more regulated again. So it's kind of a easy trick that we often remind people to practice. Some other physical kinds of things, of course, are like muscle relaxation. And you can certainly listen to, like on an app, YouTube video, CDs, books on, you know, there's lots of versions of this. But you can also kind of just do this for yourself, even just by starting with, you know, up at your head or at your neck, and essentially even just in your head, kind of holding the muscle tense for 5 seconds, and then imagining kind of releasing it for 5 seconds, and then move to your shoulders and then your arms or your chest. And you can kind of just work yourself from head to toe and kind of help work out that muscle tension in your body. Another one, of course, would be just physical activity of any kind is something that when you're feeling that extra charged up feeling when you're anxious, that having an outlet where you can kind of work out some of that energy can be very helpful, whether it's just something simple like moving and stretching, or going for a run or swimming. Any of that is obviously relevant. Any questions about that part? Pretty straightforward, right? Okay. So on the more like cognitive or emotional side of it, the thinking and feeling part that we also experience when we're anxious, One thing you'll hear kind of discussed a lot when you're feeling like your wheels are spinning and you're just really like getting frantic or feeling like you're out of control is we talk sometimes about grounding techniques. And I'm guessing some of you have maybe heard this before. This is kind of where you're bringing your awareness to your senses to kind of pull you into the present moment and ground you again, as we say, if you feel like you're, floating off. Is one of the easiest ways to do this is, notice 5 things that you see in the room where you're at. Notice 4 things you hear. Maybe 3 things you can touch, 2 things you can smell, 1 thing you can taste. So it's a very straightforward way to kind of give yourself a job in that moment, which sometimes we need when we're spinning, is to just have a focus. And it can kind of help bring you back to the room when you're feeling extra ramped up. We also talk about, of course, like self-talk or even just coaching yourself through it. This is a big part of the C in CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, is even just kind of asking yourself, all right, in this moment, what do I actually have control over here? What is a specific action I could take to make this better? All right, so what if this thing that I'm worried could happen does happen? What would be my plan, right? And kind of just talking yourself through it, walking through maybe what's your first step, and to kind of even go to what you don't want to think about. And sometimes we find, as it turns out, there may be concrete solutions we can take even in the worst case scenario, right? Like, we're pretty decent at problem solving if we allow ourselves to kind of think about that and then shift our attention. Another big part, of course, of managing anxiety is finding healthy distraction techniques, because sometimes there isn't so much a problem to solve in that moment, it's just feeling anxious. So shifting our focus to something like, of course, conversation with someone is a kind of the most obvious way that when you are actively engaging in a back and forth, it crowds out some of the noise of what we're kind of spinning our wheels over that we're anxious about. Sometimes watching a funny movie, allowing ourselves to have a good cry, like any of those things that just kind of, it's fine, we make room for it. And then we also find what's something I can do to shift my focus to something I, again, have some control over or could do to make this better. One thing I also point out to people when they're prone to overthinking and getting themselves anxious by all the analyzing and all the what ifs and all the kind of this stuff going on up here, if you're someone prone to that, is it helps to think about what's an activity I could do to distract myself or shift my focus that actually gives me something to chew on in my brain. Because you could sit and watch TV, but chances are good, because that's so passive, you'll still end up thinking about all the things bugging you. So what if instead you made a point to do, say, a crossword puzzle? Or even, as strange as it sounds, when you're really anxious, say you're laying in bed, start at 100, count backwards by 7s. Something that actually takes a little mental energy and is a little bit challenging, so that it gives you something to do, and it can kind of help shift your focus away from that thing you're spinning about. Does that kind of make sense? Okay, any thoughts on any of this?
Well, I'm just wondering, lots of times I'll wake up in the middle of the night and I'll start to think about things. And it's like, don't think about them, because you're never going to get back to sleep. What are some activities or some practices we can do that help shut the brain down a little bit?
Well, it's interesting that you put it that way, because that's actually part of what I'm going to be here to challenge us on a little bit. Is so to illustrate this is, let's imagine right now, I told you to think about a pink elephant. So I want you to get a visual in your head of, its big pink floppy ears and its pink, little tail. And now whatever you do, I want you to not think about the pink elephant. How is that going? You're not thinking about it, right? Exactly. So it's a little deceiving, because as good as we are at solving problems in our day-to-day life, thoughts and feelings are not really ours to control in the same way. And sometimes it's actually the process of trying to control them that can make it worse. So it's not so much about saying, what do I need to do to stop myself from thinking, which is, of course, if we could do that, we'd love to. And is more like, how can I, my attention needs to shift maybe to something else. And that's kind of why the things like, you know, the counting backwards from 100, or, you know, that's kind of the old school version was count sheep, which can be trouble and fine for other people. Is the idea is something that, like, it takes a little mental energy, so it pulls you away from the thing you're trying not to get so obsessed about, but it's not trying so hard to fight it. It's partly just, as weird as it sounds, giving into it sometimes is the very process of letting it go, because we call it falling asleep for a reason. If you're trying to do anything, that's an act of tension, and our job is essentially to let go. So sometimes for people who are especially stuck with sleep, for one, I'll tell you kind of just to look at it like, isn't it so nice to just lay in bed and relax and take it down a notch, and the sheets feel nice, or it's, you know, the fan is cool, that it's more about kind of not needing to have a job to do by crawling in bed. And of course, the other rule of thumb we'll tell people with sleep is if you are pretty wound up or it's not coming easily for you, after you've been laying there for a while, if you're still wide awake after an hour, you're supposed to get up. And you're supposed to do something for about 20 minutes as almost like rebooting the computer that's got that wheel spinning. And then after 20 minutes, your job is to crawl back in bed and try it again. And that's also a really well-researched thing. And the reason for it is essentially, again, if you're lying in bed and you've been so frustrated that you haven't fallen asleep yet, is that going to help you with letting go and falling? Or are you too tense and wound? And so it's kind of a reset opportunity. And so when you get up for those 20 minutes, the idea is you remove yourself from the bedroom where you're starting to kind of spin a little bit, and you do something very like light activity. You know, not so passive, you're just staring at a TV. Maybe you read a little bit. I would recommend a boring book though, so you don't get too caught up in it. Jigsaw puzzles, fine. Even dusting a little bit, something that's just enough boring that after 20 minutes, it's like, sweet, now I get to go lay down in bed and try it again. And we can come back to talking about sleep a little later, but that's the probably most common one for sure that comes up in here is, it's hard to shut my brain off when I crawl in bed and have no distractions. So we totally get that one. So one of the things too that I like to kind of point out to people is sometimes we have this kind of rule in our head as though I will kind of do these things that I enjoy once I feel like myself again, or once I feel like I'm not so anxious or I'm not so depressed. And we could wait for a long time, right? Twiddling our thumbs until we feel like we're on top of our game, especially right now where the pandemic is kind of draining and taking more out of us than usual. So I challenge people to think about what matters to them and what they might want to do, what they value, and think about how you might move toward it and do it even while still feeling anxious or uncertain or a little depressed or frustrated, because it's actually the act of doing the stuff that matters to us that stirs those feelings of contentment or even happiness. Happiness is more a side effect of investing our energy into the stuff that really matters to us, right? So as much as it's understandable that we say, I don't think I have it in me, so I'm not going to get together with those friends, for example. Sometimes, if you're willing, it's helpful to say, in spite of the fact that I don't feel like I'm going to be the best company today, I think I'll go see my friends anyway because they matter to me. And even on a good day, I really am grateful that they're in my life. So it's kind of shifting our thinking about that a little. One of the other things that is, of course, really helpful, and we talk about a lot as therapists, is the idea of what we call mindfulness. So I'm guessing people have probably heard that term. It's out in the world a lot. And it can come in a lot of forms, but the idea is essentially Some types of meditation, even prayer can fall in this example, is something that essentially is pulling your attention back to the present moment. And that's something in therapy we work on all the time, is instead of spinning our wheels about stuff that's already happened, or being fearful and anxious and trying to guess all the things that might unfold in the future, is we have an opportunity to say, I don't have a lot of control over those two things. So how can I work on putting my energy more right now in the present? And so there are a lot of activities. Again, apps, things online can definitely help with stirring some of these ideas or talking us through it. But essentially practicing these kinds of things that help us come back to the present moment, whether it's breathing exercises or guided imagery, perhaps, where we're talked through, like, imagine you're floating in a lake and it's so peaceful. There's lots of versions of this. The idea is, if we practice them even when we feel fine, then in the moment where we really need it to help calm us down, where we're really stressed, it'll be so much easier for it to come to us. So I kind of liken it to, if I were to teach you how to drive and I took you out in a blizzard to go do it, how well do you think everything would click? Right? So it's kind of the idea of like, all right, well, if you practice it under normal conditions, then it's that much more autopilot when you really need it and you aren't thinking so clearly because you don't feel great. And so that's kind of the idea behind the practice. So on the prevention side of it, these are things that you also probably know, so we'll cover them a little more quickly. There's one kind of acronym that I really like, and there's a neat book called The Brain Bible by John Arden. He's a neurologist, and he has this acronym called SEEDS. And these are things that essentially are not just helpful generally for managing stress, but they're thought of as things that help prevent cognitive decline as we age. So they're good for just brain health in general. So socializing is the first S, right? So again, this is a challenge these days, but finding ways to connect virtually when we feel like, you know, that's the safest bet. And of course, finding opportunities where maybe we can get together in person, but in a safe way. That's kind of up to us with how we might do that. But we know that that decreases those stress hormones like cortisol when you get together with people and you socialize. Just being less isolated, all of that helps. And I think, like Margaret said, is when you just feel like you're your only company and you don't get out of the house and see anybody, right? There's a certain point where we just all run out of steam and we need to kind of get recharged. And I think that's where that social part comes in. The first E he has is education, right? So learning new things. We've heard a lot of that in the pandemic, as much as it's easier said than done sometimes, is, if you have time on your hands all of a sudden, maybe this is an opportunity to try something new and challenge ourselves to kind of pick up a new hobby or learn about something we've really been curious about but never found that book about just yet. We've got the E for exercise, right? So that's something where obviously that takes different forms too, depending on what our physical limitations might be. But just in general, we know that getting some exercise helps those endorphins, and those naturally help depression and anxiety and kind of manage that stress. The D, on a related note, is for diet and the what we eat part and how that fits into it. So obviously shooting for something that's balanced. And I always tell people, if you're prone to anxiety, you also might need to consider limiting caffeine. As hard as that can sound for some people, is, you know, that can stir some people up a little too much and it may not be worth the trouble. And I think the diet thing and the exercise in particular are helpful to think about in a pandemic in particular, because if we want to talk about something that we have some control over, it's what do we do with our physical health to help build us to be a little bit more resilient against a virus in the first place? What are the things we can do to kind of keep our immune system healthier, even if there's some things working against us? But chances are there's at least a couple things in that column that'll help toward that end, right? So we've talked some in this about how are we doing with prioritizing that stuff. And then the last S is what we just talked about a bit ago, sleep, and making sure we prioritize that. and give that the due that it needs, basically, because that helps us with managing our moods and, of course, helps us think more clearly. Any questions about any of that before I get to the things that we cannot change and how to accept them column? We good? Okay. So the harder one, like I said, is kind of that, how do we accept those things we can't change? So I think it's important to clarify, I don't think of acceptance as resigning ourselves, right? Like sometimes we talk of it as though it feels like admitting defeat to just accept our circumstances. I think of it as something that's a very intentional choice, right? That it's something where we're learning to embrace and even just make room for that unknown that we don't like so much. Because like we were talking about earlier, well, on some level, what choice do we have, right? So we're allowed to wring our hands and we're allowed to grieve our losses and all those things that have changed. And I think that sometimes we do skip that step. We get in that mindset where it feels like, okay, well, I can't dwell here and I need to sort of just move on, and it's not healthy for me to sort of, you know, be upset about it. It's okay. Some of this just really stinks and we didn't ask for it and it feels unfair. I think it's totally understandable and okay to stop for a moment and say, like, this was not what I had in mind. The goal is not to stay in that place forever. It's to grieve and then say, now what, right? And so our job at this point with acceptance is to figure out how to move forward towards those things that matter to us and focus more of our energy in that column, because it kind of acts as a buffer against those things we can't control if we have at least got some of the stuff going for us that we can. I think one of the most clear examples of how we do this as human beings is when we lose someone to something like cancer. It's such a helpless, devastating feeling. It's not something we have, of course, the control over, the power to bring them back despite everything we would love to. And so one of the things I think you see, and it's not a coincidence, is we see lots of races for the cure, lots of fundraisers, lots of efforts to say, I may not have had control over this person that I lost, but I'm going to put my energy into something I can control, which is to help bring awareness, to bring money, to bring focus to a cure in the future for other people. And that's something that can help empower us and buffer against that stress of stuff we couldn't control and didn't have a say in. So acceptance work comes mostly out of those mindfulness activities we talked about, right? And finding ways to come back to the present. And I always like to point out, being mentally healthy and being resilient isn't about luck, right? It's about, even in spite of adversity, how do we work with the hand we're dealt? Even after wringing our hands and saying, not fair. And what do we do to move back towards the stuff that matters to us over and over again when we get derailed? Because that's just part of life, is sometimes, whether we meant to or not, we get off track. And so part of it is just bringing our awareness back to that. So one of the things that's kind of neat that I actually didn't realize until a few years ago is one version of this is even just noticing things you feel grateful for. So sometimes you'll hear people talk about like keeping gratitude journals or making notes of kind of things we feel grateful for. And I think it sounds like, oh, that's a nice idea, you know, but we don't really understand maybe the science behind it. As it turns out, it's kind of a neat thing that they found even just the act of noticing and making a note of what we feel grateful for trains a part of our brain that gets better at noticing in the future things we feel grateful for. So we can almost think of it as a muscle. And the more we kind of train and use that muscle, the better we are at being able to see some of the positives, even in an otherwise tough situation. And so that's a good example of how to almost literally practice that. So I had kind of talked earlier about just even making room is kind of how I put it, for uncomfortable feelings without immediately trying to fix or escape from them. So what are some of the ways that we try to escape from uncomfortable feelings? What comes to mind?
Well, we ignore them.
We try and tune them out.
Yep. We rationalize about them, say, oh, that's not really so bad. I don't have to worry about that.
Yep. We talk ourselves out of it, right? What are some behaviors we do sometimes to kind of numb or escape from things?
Probably alcohol or or something else that may help us feel better temporarily.
Exactly. Yep. A lot of times we talk about, you know, the temptation, I think, to self-medicate, right? That's a common thing, especially under stress, that people can find, well, short of a different way to solve the problem, this is a shortcut, or I don't know what else to do, and I'm going to cope by checking out, right? And alcohol, drugs, as weird as it sounds, even napping can fall in that category, right? A lot of people have had that feeling of just like, oh, I don't know how to fix anything, so I just need to check out and like sleep for a while until I kind of feel better, right? So there's lots of ways we might do that, but distress is something that's just going to be an inevitable part of our lives, whether we want it to be or not. Like we know this. There are times where we're going to have sadness. There are times we're going to feel fear. And I totally get the instinct. And as a therapist, I hear all the time, like, how do I fix those feelings? How do I get rid of those feelings? Totally understandable. But if it was that simple, do you think we'd still be even having that conversation? We're pretty smart. We would have figured that out. So maybe then the job isn't so much to get rid of those things as it is to learn how to manage and live with them. So I liken it sometimes to, you may not be able to make it go away entirely, and maybe that's not the point, but can we help get the anxiety, in this case, to be more background noise? Kind of like a white noise machine or a fan. Like, it might still be there, but it's a little more within our control whether we tune into it or tune it out again. And that's kind of more the task ahead of us, is to figure out how to make room for it and manage it without it letting it have the keys to the car, so to speak. Make sense, kind of? Okay. So one of the things that I think is always helpful to think about to catch us when we're doing this is I often use a metaphor about being in a tug of war with a monster. So if you think about kind of the situation you find yourself in as this monster, and he represents all the things you're struggling with, whether it's, in particular, in this case, anxiety or stress, maybe it's depression, maybe it's just feelings you have about yourself, right? He represents all the things, and he's this horrible, terrible, ugly, no good monster. And he's on one side of a cliff, and he's got his end of the tug-of-war rope. And over here is you on this opposite cliff with your end of this tug-of-war rope. And in between you is what appears to be a bottomless drop-off. So you've got your end of the rope, and you're strategizing, and you're thinking to yourself, okay, you know, if I pull too hard, what if he leaps across here and he could eat me for lunch? But if I don't pull hard enough, then I could kind of slip over this edge and fall down this bottomless divide. And you're calculating and you're strategizing and you're thinking of all the possible solutions and working really hard at it. And you're forgetting one. Do you know what it is?
Let go of the rope.
Bingo. We're not good at that one sometimes, right? We're solving and we're trying to figure it out. And sometimes our job is simply to drop the rope. There's not a problem that always needs to be solved. Sometimes we make room for what we feel and we move toward the stuff that matters to us in spite of it. And that's a part that is kind of freeing, even if it feels like it's not always easy, because it isn't. I like that tug of war thing in particular, because often when I tell it, people will find they can kind of keep that mantra in their head in those moments where they're really struggling and say, is this a situation where maybe I could just drop the rope, right? Okay, so I want to kind of shift as we wind down to what if the things kind of we've talked about today, what if the strategies I try at my own home, what if they're not enough? Because of course that's where people like myself come in. So a kind of gauge that I use when I talk to people is if you find that the pattern is pervasive, where it's not just kind of like, yep, I feel anxious some days, or I feel like, yeah, I went through a rough week or two and then I kind of came through again. If the pattern's pretty pervasive, or if you have way too many stressors to kind of keep your head above water, if you feel like you're kind of running out of resources or ideas, maybe you're lacking the supports that we kind of talked about that you can reach out to, that's where considering seeking help from a professional can obviously be a good call. So obviously there are lots of people in the world who might call themselves worriers or even suffer occasional panic attacks. And some of those people can improve fine without therapy or meds. So it doesn't need to be the route for everyone. But I think for those who've suffered more kind of entrenched symptoms, like the kind of anxiety disorders, like obsessive compulsive symptoms, right? Someone who's gone through a lot of traumatic events and it's hard to shake off maybe some of those survival strategies that got in the way, and more of the case like post-traumatic stress, they tend to benefit from having that more intensive kind of work of therapy. And I often think of basically my role as a therapist is to help unstick people when they're stuck. So I might see someone who's mostly got it all figured out and is high functioning in lots of areas of their life, but maybe they just feel like they've got a blind spot or they're a little extra stuck. And of course, you know, on the other end of the spectrum, there can be people who just, they struggle chronically. Maybe it runs in their family. Like, we see all range of people. So as some of you probably know, if you get to a point where you felt like you needed professional help or you wanted someone to talk to, that's where you can certainly talk to your primary care doctors. For like Mankato Clinic in particular, you get referred through one of your other providers and they can set you up with therapy. They can set you up with a psychiatrist if you wanted to talk about meds, or both. So one thing I want to do as we kind of wrap up, and then we can see if there's other questions, is I like to kind of talk about this particular metaphor that I like. ACT, the kind of therapy I do, acceptance and commitment therapy, uses lots of metaphors because I think they're a good way for things to just stick in our heads. And some of you might know this one, but it talks about a grandfather, and I think often they describe it as a Native American grandfather is talking to his grandson. And he tells his grandson that inside all of us, we have two wolves, that they're in a constant sort of battle with one another. And one wolf represents everything we might think of as good: love, hope, peace, justice. And the other wolf represents what we maybe consider to be bad, you know, hate, rage, envy, jealousy, greed. And he says that they're always kind of locked in a battle with one another. And the grandson says, so which one wins? And the grandfather says, whichever one I feed. Right? So I think in this case, our job is to check in with ourselves to say, how am I doing at feeding the right wolf? We may not have a lot of control over some of those things that fall in that bad column, or the things we don't want that we can't control, but we do have some say in what we feed and how we take care of ourselves. And that's kind of where that acceptance part comes in. So I have a couple book recommendations for those of you who like reading a little bit more on these topics, if it stirred some interest for you. So I'll tell you those and then we can kind of check in about questions. So one in particular that I like, I'll show you so you can see it's got kind of this fun little upside down grass. It's called When Things Might Go Terribly, Horribly Wrong, which is quite the title, I know. and it's by Kelly Wilson. And this is kind of my go-to for anxiety, but it's also a good introduction to this acceptance and commitment therapy that I practice, because one of the founders is the person who wrote the book. So it can kind of expand on some of the things I've talked about today. The other one that I often recommend is called When Things Fall Apart. And that's by Pema Chodron. That's Pemachadron. And she is, of all things, a Canadian Buddhist nun, as interesting as that combination sounds. And she's often recommended by both therapists and clergy as sort of a really peaceful and kind of a spiritual maybe version of these same things we've talked about today. And there's a lot of overlap between some of that like Eastern philosophy and all that acceptance and impermanence. So it's a great introduction to that for those who want to read more. Okay, so questions, things that stirred, stories that maybe come up as we were talking.
If you have anything to say, feel free to unmute yourself. I'm watching here and trying to fill in until I see a microphone unmute. Well, I'll just start by saying, there are some of us, myself included, who my strongest incentive to get something done is an impending deadline. So I would think that there are some cases where that anxiety or stress can be not only self-imposed, but also be beneficial to the process. Is that true, or is that a rationalization?
No, I mean, well, as someone who also works like that, I hope it's true, because that's kind of what I often find too. I think a lot of it is, again, always comes down to like balance of like, okay, if we kind of do it that way all the time, that's probably going to take a toll on us, versus for, stuff that's maybe bigger or more important, that we kind of have that mindset that having a fire under us can be a helpful thing, right? Mm-hmm.
Anybody?
I try to maybe not necessarily with deadlines, but I try to do what I found during this time is do some to-do lists so that I can focus on something daily or at least weekly that will take my mind off of, I haven't seen my family since March and some of those things, or, I only go to the grocery store and that's it. So if I make a to-do list, that kind of helps me each day I look at my list, and then when I accomplish that, I'm also thinking about other things, whether I'm doing a painting or whatever it is, I have something different to focus on.
Right, it gives us something to chew on, and I think that's part of, there's a couple things that makes me think about is, something I'll often tell people is, we're used to that saying, basically, of you can't see the forest through the trees. We often hear that. And I always kind of find it to be a strange saying, because in my experience with anxious people, I find the opposite is often the issue, that we get so bogged down by forests that sometimes what helps us most is to pick a tree and decide, this is the thing that I'm going to kind of tackle today. So your idea of, I think, even when it feels like there's 100 things, again, that we don't have control over, all of those trees become overwhelming, that you say, what's a tree today that's kind of my focus? What's something I can literally do? And I think on a related note, one of the things that's important too is sometimes when we are feeling more taxed, whether it kind of shows up now in feeling anxious, or certainly when we're feeling depressed, is we overshoot a little bit with what we think we should be able to do. And instead of kind of finding a middle ground, we beat ourselves up about not achieving or pulling off the things we usually can. So what I'll often remind people is, find ways to kind of incrementally get to where you want to go, right? So if we think of our values as those goalposts in one form or another, I would argue, for example, if you say, well, I'd really like to be a person who exercises for 45 minutes, 5 days a week. Awesome, good for you. Except, how are you going to get there, right? So maybe if you feel like today you can barely get out of bed because you're so drained, your goal is to walk around the block one time. And people might laugh at me and say, well, that's so easy. And I would say that's kind of the point, is sometimes when we're overwhelmed, we're stressed, we're depressed, we're anxious, is we lose momentum. And our goal is to try and even like get that back. Because as you've probably noticed, starting is often the hardest part when we feel stuck. And so just kind of saying, I'm going to start with just walking around the block. Or another example might be like cleaning in our houses. When we're stressed, it's like, oh, I feel like a jerk because all the dishes are piled up. Well, how about instead of saying, I guess I need to be a person who somehow like, you know, has a fire under her to do an entire like 2 hours of dishes, you commit instead to saying, I'm going to wash 5 dishes and then I'm off the hook. Because guess what? It's better than 0 dishes. It's still reaching something and succeeding in some way. And again, it might flip that switch where once you're already washing dish 5, dish 6 doesn't seem like such a big deal and you kind of start picking up steam again. So I think that's an important part when we're under stress, is scaling our expectations and setting goals that are a little bit more realistic for us. Good question.
All right, well, I'm not seeing a whole lot right now. Is there anything you'd like to do further to wrap up, Katie?
Nothing I can think of. I think we covered a lot of ground, which I know sometimes is a little tiring. But as we know, like the pandemic is definitely testing us. So if anything, I think that part of what's going to happen is we'll probably see more people showing up for that mental health as the dust starts to settle when we do come out of it. Like right now, I think it's understandable. We're kind of a bit in crisis mode, right? And we're just trying to kind of get by and manage. So our job at the moment is more just to kind of focus on taking care of ourselves as we kind of think toward, cool, when I start to get to have some of these things back in the future, gives me something to look forward to, and then I'll just be extra ready to hit the ground running. Hang in there.
Yep, don't be hard on yourselves for some things you can't control.
Absolutely. Got to accept that stuff and do the best we can. That serenity prayer is always a good gut check, right?
Yep, when I was in high school and college, I had a job that I always dreaded going to it, but once I got there, I was fine.
Yep.
It was just getting through that stuff that you can't imagine or you can't.
Right. And that's the part where sometimes just act in the direction of your values, even if your thoughts and feelings don't feel like they're totally sold and on board. And sometimes we surprise ourselves that way. Well, thanks for letting me talk to you guys today. Hopefully it was helpful, and you know, we'll all get to go outside and be amongst each other without masks on someday down the road.
Thank you very much.
Yep.
Thank you.
Stay safe, everybody.
Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.